Welcome everyone to Accelerant's Executive Series webinar, Why Budgeting is Mission Critical for Nonprofits. My name is Joanne Brunn and I run client services for Accelerant, and I will be moderating the discussion today. Each month we present a new topic related to the budgeting process designed to inspire you to transform your thinking. Last month, along with Linda Murphy Church from the prestigious Rhode Island School of Design, we discussed how she applied the Malcolm Baldrige Excellence Criteria to evaluate and then justify changes to the university's budget process. So you can listen to that informative webinar by clicking on the blog link at accelerant.com or downloading the white paper in our news and events section. I'm very pleased to have on our panel today Jill Larsen, the CFO of the Baptist General Convention of Texas, and Steve Meisberger, the CFO of the American Youth Soccer Organization. The Baptist General Convention of Texas has been using our software for about 4 years, and the American Youth Soccer Organization is a recent client whose BudgetPack software has been implemented and is on track to roll out to the organization over the next few months. So we have deliberately chosen these two clients because the differences in their situation will lend a broad perspective to this webinar. Both Jill and Steve will explain why they believe budgeting is mission critical for nonprofit organizations, especially in today's economy, and how budgeting should be tied to strategy. They will talk about the needs of the various stakeholders in the budget process, department managers, finance team, and executives, and why everyone's participation and ownership is crucial in order to produce a solid plan. So it's our intention that as you listen to Jill and Steve speak about their experiences and these issues, that you will find similarities within your own organization, which will lead you to think about budgeting and the budgeting process in a new light. Before we begin, I'd like to address some housekeeping points. First, make sure that you are viewing this presentation in full screen mode. You can do that by maximizing your screen using the icon in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, or by using the controls on the bottom right corner of your GoToMeeting screen. Second, everyone on the call is muted, so if you'd like to ask a question anytime during the presentation, just click on the question box on your GoToWebinar panel and enter it via your keyboard. So we'll be collecting questions throughout the presentation and answering as many as we can at the end, time permitting. If we don't have time to address your question on the call today, we will follow up with you. So we will begin today's webinar with Jill and Steve describing their background, their role in their organization, and an overview of their organization's mission and the population that it serves. We will then move on to a discussion of why budgeting is mission critical for nonprofit organizations and the impacts of the recent economy. We'll then talk about the various stakeholders in the process, the department heads, senior management, and the finance team, and how all of their needs come into play during the budgeting process. Then Jill and Steve will talk about their budgeting process and what prompted them to look for a dedicated budgeting solution. They'll next relate their goals for implementation, and Jill will talk about what actually happened in her organization. We will wrap up with Jill and Steve's recommendations for all of you as you are considering changing your budget process. And at the end of the webinar, if time permits, we will address any questions that you have. So let's get started. Jill, would you please introduce yourself and describe your background, your role in the organization, and give us an overview of your organization's mission and the population that it serves?
Sure, I'd be glad to. I'm Jill Larsen. I'm the Treasurer and Chief Financial Officer of the Baptist General Convention of Texas. We're a state organization that relates to about 5,400 churches, Baptist churches in Texas. We have about 270 employees, about 40 departments, and our actual operating budget is about $38 million a year. We receive close to $80 million a year. Some of that passes on to other organizations. So we actually exist to encourage and facilitate our churches with their evangelism and missions, advocacy, and education and discipleship.
Okay, thank you, Jill. Steve, would you now please introduce yourself and describe your background, your role in your organization, and a bit of an overview of your organization's mission and the population that it serves?
Sure, be happy to. Good afternoon, everyone. My role is that of Chief Financial Officer for the past 10 years at AYSO, which is the largest centrally managed youth sports organization in the U.S. We generate about $75 million annually in revenue, and AYSO is all about introducing kids to their first soccer experience in a fun, safe, and family-involved environment. We're affiliated with the United States Soccer Federation, which in turn is part of FIFA, and these are the entities that are the national and international governing bodies for soccer throughout the world. From a membership perspective, AYSO has about 600,000 player participants and 300,000 volunteers. And except for the 55 paid staff at our Torrance, California headquarters, we're an all-volunteer-run organization that presents some challenges in the budget process that we'll probably talk about later. As of December 2011, we had players in 35 states. From an organizational structure perspective, we have approximately 1,000 local leagues we call regions. These roll up into 125 areas and then finally into 14 sections spread geographically around the country. Now, each one of these sections is managed by a senior volunteer who typically has been with AYSO for 5 to 10 years. These key volunteers are called section directors, and they're a critical part of AYSO's management team. I guess you could think of them as a kind of a regional vice president that you might find in the for-profit world. Regarding background, prior to AYSO, I have about 20-plus years experience in senior financial consulting and information technology positions spanning several industries, including music retail, where I was the Vice President of Finance for Virgin Entertainment Group, consulting, where I worked for Deloitte Consulting in providing ERP system selection and implementation project management solutions for retail and hospitality industry clients. And then finally home building, where as a Director of Information Systems for KB Home, one of the country's largest home builders, I built and managed all sales and customer service applications. So that's a little bit about me and my background. Joanne.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Okay, so let's move on. Jill, let's start with you. Why do you believe that budgeting is critical in nonprofit organizations?
I think our organization is like most nonprofits in that we never have as much money as we would like to accomplish our mission. So I think budgeting is really critical to be sure that we're allocating the resources that we do have in the best way to accomplish what we need to accomplish. And our budget really helps drive that decision-making process.
So has this always been the case that budgeting is mission critical, and what changed? What has changed recently? Like, why now and not later?
Well, I think in my organization, which was founded in 1886, as far back as I can go, I can find that budgets were done. I think in the last decade it has been particularly important, and especially over the last 3 or 4 years with the recession. Baptist churches are a little unusual in that giving by our churches is entirely voluntary. And so as the recession hit, it meant that our churches were not receiving as much money from their members, which meant that they weren't sending as much money to us. So particularly in the last 4 years with the recession, budgeting has become even more critical as we've tried to manage accomplishing our mission within the resources that we've had.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. So, Steve, would you share with us why you believe that budgeting is critical in nonprofits and whether this has always been the case?
Well, first of all, I agree with Jill. There's never seems to be enough money to go around at budget time. Unlike the for-profit companies in my past life, a nonprofit organization like AYSO can't sell stock, or we can't float revenue bonds. So we're dependent primarily on only one source of revenue, and for us, that's player registrations. We do get some revenue from sponsors and a few contributions here and there, but mostly our revenue comes from player registrations, and that's about 85 to almost 90% from this single source. Each child that's registered at one of our local regions generates a national player fee, which right now is $15 per child. And the vast majority of this funding comes in a very narrow window, a 2 to 3 month period each spring, which is right now, actually, it's happening for this upcoming fall playing season. So we get a lot of money only once a year, and that's all we get, and so we need to manage it and invest it wisely because that's it until next year. So for this reason, having a very detailed and accurate budget is essential to our survival. Now, as an experienced Excel user, I've been relying upon spreadsheets to get this job done for a number of years, and over the years, these have grown into a bit of a monster to manage. With about 200 individual worksheets, and a lot of those have complex formulas, and they're all linked to intermediate and top-level roll-up files. They're mistake-prone, and it's been nearly impossible for me to delegate any of the budget process to my controller and her finance staff because no one else can seem to figure out my spreadsheets. So maybe that's job security, I don't know. So a few years ago, I began to look into some alternative solutions to help get this under control.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Great. So let's kind of dig into the economy a little bit more. Steve, to continue on that, you talked, a bit that the economy has definitely impacted your organization. So could you talk about, is there more scrutiny on the budget process than in the past, and is there more pressure to manage expenses better and to justify those expenses?
Yes, very much so. The economy has had a lot of impact on us. And I have to say, not so much in the beginning. And by the beginning, for us, I'm kind of placing a marker in late 2008, early 2009, when the value of everybody's homes and 403B plans seemed to take a dive. So in those first couple of years, we were a little bit insulated. And I always try to analyze why that is, and it seems that the psychology of parents is initially to protect our kids from those kind of events by continuing to sign them up for, piano lessons and Little League football, and in our case, soccer. But beyond that, as the economic downturn continued, it finally began to hit us, and hit us pretty hard. In fact, we've had a decline in player count of almost 100,000 players over the past 5-year period. And so a minute ago I mentioned the vast majority of our revenue comes from that one single source, player registration revenue. So it's had a definite impact on us. And because of that, to answer your second question, there's been a lot more scrutiny placed on the budget process. And that's because as the budget pie gets smaller, we've had to cut back on some of the program and training delivery. And in some cases even reduce our head count. So as that available budget pie shrank, the competition for what was left obviously increased. And the expenses we do have, we have to come up with greater justifications for those expenses. As we begin to cut programs, more and more of our executive members, those volunteer management folks, who were usually oblivious to the budget process, began to awaken, and they started paying more attention as well, asking for and digging into more details, challenging financial reports and budget assumptions. So, again, more reasons for us to have as accurate a budget as possible.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you, Steve. So, Jill, can you take it from your perspective for how the economy has impacted the Baptist General Convention of Texas, and if you've seen more scrutiny and pressure on the budget now than in previous years?
Yeah, and I think in some ways our experience is similar to Steve's, that as the economy hit, as the recession hit, we were receiving less. But I think on the scrutiny side, I think folks are much more aware now. I think our board members are much more savvy maybe than they used to be about financial matters, and so I think there's additional scrutiny just because they are more educated in financial matters maybe than they were 10 or 20 years ago. And I think with our churches there's more scrutiny because they have more choices to make about their funds as well. Are they going to do missions directly through their church? Are they going to send money on to us? So I think there's more scrutiny, and I think our budget, while it's very complex, helps us address those questions and concerns, and also provides for us a mechanism for reporting our actual results throughout the year as well. I think our pressure really comes from at this point, our giving. Our receipts have pretty well leveled off last year, but with inflation and because we have been in a recessionary period, we haven't given pay increases. So we're trying to stretch those dollars even further now with, having about the same amount of money coming in, but having our costs go up and need for our costs to go up in some of our employment areas as well.
Okay. So let's kind of continue, Jill. So your organization has been using Budget Pack for a number of budget cycles now. I think it's up to, or you're on your fourth one.
Right, going into fourth.
Okay. Can you share with us why you feel it's been important to get more management participation in and ownership of their budget numbers?
Oh yes, this was really my pet peeve when I've been here at the convention for 8 years. The first 4 years as controller, who's really the person who manages the budget detail process. And what we found is when we used Excel, we had an in-house program before, then we used Excel, then we had an Access database program that was particularly horrible that we had built. And what we found is in some of, particularly in our salaries, there was just no way for us to provide the detail of headcount to our managers in a confidential manner. So we wound up budgeting all the headcount in the accounting department, but then they never quite took ownership of it. We would give it to them, they would see it, and yet if there was ever a problem in a headcount budget or anywhere in their budget, it was kind of like, because they didn't take the process all the way through, it was like, well, accounting did something to our numbers. We don't know what, but we weren't responsible. So I think with Budget Pack that has changed dramatically, and that our managers really budget everything within their budget. We do have the capability to set some calculations for our benefits and payroll taxes and that sort of thing, but everything else they have direct control of. And so what we find then when it gets to the management part of the budget is they know where those numbers came from, and they know either why they're on target or why they're not, when their actual numbers match or don't match to those budgets.
Mm-hmm. So they really are in control and owning their budgets at this point.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. So what do you expect of your managers, now, given today's economy? Is there more pressure on them? Are you expecting them to have even tighter control over their budgets?
We do. We budget at a project level detail, which for us is typically a ministry level detail, and so they have to budget for that, which means they have to plan for each component of their ministry into those project levels, and then we monitor that throughout the year. They've set the budget all up, excuse me, in Budget Pack. They've spread it across the year, and then on a monthly basis they're producing, actually out of our financial package, reports and monitoring those. So a lot of the scrutiny that goes on during the year, they're really going back to those initial assumptions that they made in the budget process. We have a fairly involved review process throughout the budget preparation. It goes through upper management review at least twice, sometimes 3 or 4 times before we finalize it. And the reports that we get from Budget Pack allow us to see all the detail, and also to be able to see some of the notes that the budget managers made about their assumptions in a particular area as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so does that help them, having that as the assumptions in there, so that they can better apply the strategic direction that your organization has set forth, applying it in their budget? So does that help them?
It does. I think, too, it helps us as we're reviewing. I don't know about other people's experience, but we never hit the target the first time through. You say, okay, here's kind of what we're aiming for, and somehow magically you never quite hit that target the first time. So by having the level of detail that we do in Budget Pack, it really allows us to have those conversations on multiple levels with the manager, with their manager, and then at the executive level to be able to scrutinize those and say, okay, what you said was important was Ministry X, but where you've increased your proposed budget is in Ministry Y. Let's talk about that. Is that really, why is that? What are your let's talk about the process there. And then some of it, we can see assumptions that they have made. So it really facilitates that whole thing. Ours is a very interactive process. With a lot of conversation going on. So the Budget Pack has really facilitated that greatly.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you, Jill. So Steve, moving over to your organization, let's take these kind of questions one at a time. Why do you feel that it's important for you to get more management participation and ownership of the budget numbers?
Well, here again, I agree with Jill. Ownership is key. We have a responsibility accounting financial statement organization where all of my peers, my colleagues, the director of programs, the director of events, etc., they're responsible for their own financial unit and performance, and of course the budget is a key part of that. I found that any time that you increase the participation in a project, the ownership of that, as time goes on, is much higher. So I think it's more likely we'll produce more accurate budgets that are more realistic and achievable if the people responsible for those individual departments are as deeply involved in the creation of the budget as I am now. One of my goals would be that this is no longer just a Steve project. I'd like it to be a group project.
Right, exactly. Exactly. So are you expecting more now from your department managers given the changes in the economy?
We are. The budget pie shrinkage that I mentioned earlier, doesn't play favorites. It's affecting all of us. And it's not just me having to justify individual parts of my budget. It's also my colleagues. And so budgeting is even more important, for them now than it ever was. And I need a higher level of participation from them, and they need to be more involved so that as we go forward into the actual year when the budget becomes the current fiscal year, it'll be something that they'll be familiar with and they'll own, and they'll be able to speak to variances instead of me having to pull it out of them like with pliers every month. Well, how come there's a variance here? And they seem to have forgotten all of those assumptions and things they gave me on Post-its and scraps of paper throughout the budgeting process.
Mm-hmm. I don't know how that could happen. Exactly. So
I save all of those. I never throw those away.
I'm sure you have a whole pile in your closet someplace.
Job security.
So we haven't quite talked about your budget process yet, but is there a way that you can get your managers to understand what the strategy is today that you're trying to get to, and how they're expected to apply that in their budgets today?
Is that to me?
Yes, Steve.
Well, we do have a strategic planning document, and it does have some depth to it. There are some individual department goals, and it's one of my tasks is to help each one of my colleagues, through the budget process to manage their assumptions and what they're submitting in terms of budget requests, to kind of help them see whether it aligns or doesn't align with the overall strategic planning document. Sometimes it doesn't, and that kind of takes you down the path of fund requests and capital expenditure requests that don't further the strategic plan. And so, that helps me have that discussion with them during the budget process.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So let's continue on, Steve, about your budgeting process today. So can you talk about how it works today, who's involved, how long it takes, what tools you use?
Sure. Well, I guess the simple word to describe it is it's a long process. It's about 7 months out of the year, from November 1st of each year until the following May, where I actually present the final budget to our executive members. It's, I don't know, anywhere from 600 to 1,000 folks who show up at our annual meeting every year during Memorial Day weekend, and you present the budget to them, and there's a question and answer session, and that's always it's a fun process. And they vote on the budget. Now, some of the reason for this length is due to just the nature of the nonprofit world, where decisions are spread out among lots of people, a lot of committees and task forces. And there's really nothing I can do about that other than to have rock solid information that I can give all of these folks on why we assumed what we assumed. But another reason for the length of the process being so long, at least in my case, is that spreadsheets are just cumbersome to work with. As I mentioned before, they're mistake prone. There's tons of formulas. It's hard to distribute templates to people you want to help participate in the process, and get those templates back with good data, if at all. It's difficult to link and roll up those spreadsheets. Turnaround on, just speaking for my organization, the budget process is an iterative process. There's always half a dozen different versions before it's final. And getting budget changes throughout all of these, dozens and scores of spreadsheets, and making changes is difficult to do. So it's the second reason I think I can do something about, and hence my search for a more elegant software tool to manage the process.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Steve. So I'm going to move back over to Jill. And Steve, if I could ask you to put yourself on mute in between. We're hearing some background noise. I'm not quite sure.
Very good.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, Jill, so I know this might take you back a few years in time, but and you did mention a bit about going from Excel to Access and a couple of different solutions, but could you talk to us about what your budgeting process was like prior to using Budget Pack, how long it took, who got involved, what was the general process?
Yeah, I think our experiences was similar to what Steve has described. When we were using Excel, we would send a template out to our 40 departments. We would have formulas built in there. We would have their account numbers in there. Some level of maybe their salary information in there, and then typically they have 2 or 3 weeks to kind of formulate their budget. And send it back to us. Then we would have to manually take all those 40 spreadsheets and try to roll them up. And of course, in the meantime, our non-expert Excel users, or even our Excel experts, would modify those worksheets so that when you tried to roll them up, nothing lined up like it was supposed to. So it was kind of the same process we have now, which is essentially the department prepares their budget, the manager over kind of next level of management reviews it, and then highest level of management reviews it. But it was extremely difficult in Excel, first to know where everybody was in the process, whether they had started, how far along were they, and then to get the information back with enough time for our accounting group to take the 40 worksheets and try to get them into some kind of order that we could use. Our Access solution that we had similar problems. We still couldn't see where people were in the process, but it actually added an extra step, because then we had to export it out to Excel and then import it into our accounting software in order to get reporting. And so it was just very cumbersome, and that's really the not being able to know where people were in the process, and not being able to have any idea about kind of where we were on as far as hitting our target budget number, and being able to roll those up by our different larger groups, which we call centers. It really led us to look for another solution, which ultimately led us to Accelerant and Budget Pack.
Okay, so let's just continue on that theme a little bit. I mean, you've given us a lot of reasons why you decided to move away from Excel and the other solutions and look for a dedicated budgeting solution. Could you kind of sum that up? Like, what was the biggest moment where you just said, sort of, enough was enough? How could you describe that?
Our challenge is we start our budgeting process June 1st. We have a relatively small accounting group. I really have, besides the controller, there's really only 2 accountants that can work on budget. We have other accounts payable and cash receipts people, but we have a very small group, and they finish up the audit. We're a year-end calendar year organization, so they finish up the audit mid-April, mid-May, somewhere along there, and we went straight into budgeting from that, so they don't really get much break. And then it was taking so much time for them to get all this information back from the departments and try to get it cleaned up and compiled or imported into our financial software, and it really was at the point that our accounting staff was just, by the time we got to the end of budget, they've spent now 7 months either in audit or budget, and they're just fried. And in the meantime, we're not getting all our other accounting work done. And then to pile on to that, I have had managers that really didn't feel like they had full control over their budget preparation process, so that they really had that full accountability for it once we got to the final solution. So it really was just to try to find a way where I got that combination of being able to prepare a budget in a timely manner and have my budget managers really be responsible and be accountable for it, that drove us to an outside solution.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And just curious, did you ever consider using your GL for budgeting?
We did consider that, but it was really, you have to remember, most of our managers are ministers, mm-hmm. So they're not financial people first and foremost, and they're really not computer people, and so both Excel was too hard for them. That was one of the reasons we eliminated virtually every other software package that we found for budgeting. But the solution in our financial software was just too complicated for them, and because we budget by project, it was really too risky for us to kind of turn them loose in there. So we looked at it briefly and just didn't feel like it was possible for us.
Okay. And so we're segueing into this, what was the process you took to investigate budgeting software solutions? It sounds like you were looking at something that was very easy, that your ministers could use, that you didn't have to be accounting people.
We were, and it was interesting. Our IT folks helped us. We talked to Gartner. We talked to we actually outsourced our internal audit function. We talked to them, talked to our external auditors to just get some likely candidates for the process. We actually came across Accelerant through a web search, which everybody does a web search now for everything. So we came across Accelerant through our web search, and we sent out an RFP. We went through demos of the software, and I think we demoed a total of 5 or 6, and every one of them except for Budget Pack, the main selling point was it's just like Excel, so your people can do it. Well, my problem is my people can't do Excel, so that wasn't really a selling point. And then we got to the Budget Pack demo, and it was like, oh, my people can do this. It was just so, you didn't have to be an accountant. You just clicked through, and it was very logical. And so at our first glimpse of it, we thought, gosh, this really could work for our folks.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you, Jill. So, Steve, I hear you on the line. So before I move to the next question here, could you comment on what Jill was talking about? Did you have a similar situation, why you decided to move away from Excel, not use your GL, and how did you come to investigate the budgeting solutions?
Sure. On the GL question, I did look at that. We use Great Plains by Microsoft, and for many of the same reasons that Joe mentioned, most notably, we do a lot of project accounting. It just wasn't a solution to use Great Plains. And although I don't have a lot of ministers in my organization, I have a lot of PC illiterate folks, and if Excel is difficult for them, signing into Great Plains would have been an impossible task. So that wasn't an option for us. I'm sorry, the second part of that question?
Right. So the process you took to investigate to find Budget Pack? Mm-hmm.
Sure. Well, I kind of put my old consulting hat back on and went out into the to the world to see what solutions were out there. I was looking for, as I mentioned earlier, a simple, elegant tool that more folks outside of myself and the finance department could use. And what I found was that there were just a ton of solutions out there, but many of them were either too big and or complex for AOS, so just not a good fit. I had some experience in my past lives with a couple of really large products, Hyperion, which I think is now an Oracle product, and Cognos, which is a data warehouse kind of solution that I think is part of IBM now, and then just a sundry list of others solutions, but they all seemed to have the same thing in common. They were either very large, complex, or very expensive. And so as it happened, I actually missed in my initial casting for solutions, Accelerant and Budget Pack, but my controller found this. She was also working on this project and brought it to my attention. And it immediately had a good look and appearance to it. It was, as Jill said, just like Excel, and so while we didn't do as formal an RFP, I think, as Jill did, we did, look at some demos on some of the other products I mentioned, and had quite a few demos actually by Accelerant and webinars. It just seemed to have a good cost and overall fit for AOI. So in terms of the process, I made a presentation first to our national executive director, who's my direct superior, and then got his buy-in to it, and then ultimately made a formal presentation to our full board of directors. That's one of the committees that approves everything, and it had your standard project request items in it, hard and soft costs, cost savings and time savings, and those kinds of things. And they voted to give me approval to do the project.
Okay. So was it an active initiative? Did you have a budget set aside to buy software?
I did, but I was out of sync by 1 year. I had I was at the tail end when we first met the folks at Accelerant, a budget year, and I was just completing another one of those long, arduous 7-month processes. And I had set aside some money for the upcoming budget year, but we actually started this process and got it approved in the budget year where there were no budget funds for this. We had some funds left over from other projects that we were able to use. So I did, but I wish I could say I was smart enough to put it in the year. I was going to request it, but I didn't. The key thing is, though, we got the solution and we're on our way to implementing it. So.
Exactly. It worked out. So, Jill, could you respond to that also? How did you get approval to buy Budget Pack? Did you have an active initiative? Did you have a budget set aside?
We actually did not have a budget either, but it was we were in a state of a lot of change here in our organization. Fortunately, this kind of decision doesn't have to go to our board. So I basically went to our executive director and said, we have to do this, and here's where I found the money to do it. And so we found some unspent funds for capital use that we could use for this. And I think you could see that kind of look of desperation in my eye of we've got to do something different because what we're doing now is making us all crazy.
Very creative solution to the problem then. Exactly. So let's move on to the stakeholders in the process. So as we're all aware, there are many stakeholders to consider in the budget process. The three main stakeholders are the department heads, senior management, and you in finance. Now each of these groups of people have different needs in the process and no doubt different complaints about what they need to do, what they need to get out of the budget. So, Steve, if I could start with you, what needs of your department managers were you most concerned with when investigating solutions, and what complaints were you hearing from them?
Well, the biggest complaint I was hearing was they wanted something simpler than Excel spreadsheets. My colleagues are very good at what they do, and they're a little more familiar with Excel than some of our volunteer base, but they were growing tired of my my Excel templates. So I needed something simple and easy for them to use. Also, and this is a really big thing, it's much easier, as you know, to predict the future when you're pretty confident about where you're at in the current year and leading up to the budget year. And it was always difficult, if not impossible, to include in my budget templates the most accurate, up-to-date current information. And so that was a key thing I noticed in looking into Accelerant, that it was now appearing to be very easy to suck in actual data right up to through the most current month you have, so you can present a forecast next year for the next year budget, which is actual data through the beginning of the current fiscal year through whatever month you're at, and then you can add in guesstimated information for the rest of the current year, and that helps I think will help my managers, my colleagues in projecting the budget when they have a better look and feel for where we're at currently. 7 months in advance of the year is a long time, and budgets they depreciate pretty rapidly, especially over a 7-month period of time. So being able to give them that extra information was a big thing for us.
Mm-hmm. And if you could talk a bit about your end users, because they're the volunteers, I don't imagine they can complain a lot about the process, but what were you concerned about with addressing their needs beyond the simplicity of the product?
Well, this may be the most exciting part about this project, because they're volunteers and this user base is less involved with PCs and financial issues. They haven't been involved much at all in the budget process. Earlier in this presentation, I talked about the increasing scrutiny in the budget as the pie shrinks and programs tend to be cut. This key group of 14 section director volunteer managers are now becoming more interested in what parts of the programs Steve may be looking at cutting. So I think having this tool, being able to expand the base of users involved in the budget process to loop in for the first time ever this volunteer group will be a good thing.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Now let's move on to the third part of the puzzle here. What about the board of directors or executive management? What needs were you concerned with there, and what complaints might they have had in the past about the budgeting process?
Well, I think I mentioned the turnover on budget changes was kind of time consuming. If you can just imagine dozens and in some cases hundreds of budget templates and assumptions are changed throughout the 7-month process. Sometimes it takes a couple of weeks to turn around and produce a top-level budget for them to look at. So they're interested in more quick turnarounds for budget changes. Obviously more accurate information, and they too are interested in looping in this key group of volunteer section directors who haven't yet been involved in the budget process.
Okay, so if you could then think back, who most wanted this change? You, your finance team, your executive management?
Well, everybody had a say in this, but I'd have to say selfishly it was a mix between myself and my department managers. Mm-hmm. Ultimately we as paid staff were, there's a fine line between a volunteer management and paid staff. You hope volunteers will follow through on things, but at the end of the day, they're volunteers, and sometimes they're not as responsive. And so we think, I and my department managers, my colleagues, we think this will help us address those situations where some of these volunteer managers may drop the ball somewhat, and it'll be easier for us to step in and take over.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Steve. So, Jill, moving over to you. So I imagine that you also had various stakeholders in the process with their own sets of needs and complaints. So can you share with us kind of the one at a time what these groups were most concerned with and which group was the most vocal in pushing for a change?
I think with our department managers, they really were looking for work, and I don't think that they knew that what they were doing was too hard, and it was really out of their comfort zone. So I don't think it occurred to them that there was another possibility because it was just the way it had always been. But the complaints were it's hard, and then with the access program that we had written, we had a lot of just technical glitches of data getting just kind of lost somehow, or system not being available and that kind of thing. With my finance team, like I mentioned, just the time that it took to try to get all the information out, get it back, get it compiled was just horrendous. And so they were really interested when I started talking to them about the dedicated solution of just that maybe it would be a little more manageable from a time perspective for them. I think our executive team really were probably the least involved for us, and mainly because by the time it got to them, it was all slick and pretty, and so it wasn't, other than just hearing, concern from the department managers, it really wasn't as big an issue for them. I think as far as who wanted to change the most, it probably was me, because I knew what a dedicated solution could do as far as easing the process for our department managers, giving us the capability to budget salaries in a confidential manner where they had control of that, but also being able to monitor the process as we went along, and then obviously giving some relief to our finance team. I actually had not ever worked in a dedicated budget software before. I had seen demos before, but I just felt like that we were at a point with the size and complexity of our organization that there was just a lot of benefit kind of across the board that we would gain from a dedicated package.
Okay, thank you. So, Jill, to continue along there, you talked about there's a lot of gain. Did you have specific goals in mind when you were implementing the solution? Did you have actually? Yeah. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think our primary goal was accountability of just our managers being able to manage their budget from beginning to end. And along with that, being able to get through the process in a more efficient manner where we weren't having to work our people so hard. As Steve mentioned earlier, our process, I think all nonprofits' processes are very long. We spend about 2 months actually preparing our budget, and then it takes us 3 to 4 months to get all the way through the approval process by the time we go through a finance committee, a board approval, and then on to our annual meeting. And so I wanted something where we could get through that process more efficiently and have better documentation as well about decisions that we had made along the way.
Okay. What were you hoping anything would change for the organization as a whole by being able to budget better?
I think the key was just the goal really was more just the knowledge. When you in the process that we were using, I think it was very difficult for our managers to kind of retain the thread. And so one of my goals was, besides accountability, was just that they would be more comfortable with their budgets, and they would understand kind of how they got to where they ended up more. One of the goals that's kind of a sidelight for us that it's one of those things you kind of hope for, but you never really say it in case it doesn't happen. But our budgeting process is actually faster now, while we still allow the 2 months for budget preparation time. Last year we finished somewhere between a week and 2 weeks faster than we ever had before. And I think in large part, I know in large part that was due to our staff is comfortable with Budget Pack now, and they're comfortable with the process. And it's just so much more efficient for us to work through it and be able to roll up the numbers and see everything to the point that if we kind of retain that efficiency this year, next year I'll probably actually start our process a little bit later, which will be a huge advantage because, again, we're budgeting, 7 months ahead of when we start our budget, 7 months ahead of when the budget starts. And so it's really difficult to know how to predict and prepare for that so far in advance. So even a couple of weeks later would give us better knowledge and better information to be able to prepare that budget.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you, Jill. So, Steve, can you share with us what you're hoping will happen in a few months when you roll out to your volunteer base and your finance team?
Sure. Actually, I hope and plan to use this for the next budget cycle up, which for us begins November this year. And I'm hoping for all of the standard successes you have with project implementations, a smooth rollout, no problems, a quick learning curve. I'm hoping for immediate user acceptance, especially by my department head colleagues and these key volunteer managers. I'm looking for a payback to my original project proposal to the board that we actually have to report back on all significant projects. We have to come back to them after a 6-month period of time and say, I asked you for this approval for this project, and I said, A, B, and C would happen, and now I have to actually show them that A, B, and C happened, or why not? And so I'm looking for some obvious successes in that regard. To meet some of the goals I mentioned earlier, quicker turnaround on budget changes. I want to increase my user involvement and user acceptance.
Okay, great. Thank you, Steve. So we've got about 5 minutes left, and we did have one slide in here about the current budget process for you, Jill, but I think you've really explained to us in detail about what's changed and how are you more strategically managing your business. So I'd like to move on to the recommendations piece. Just because I think the people on the call would be interested to know, kind of in wrapping up, what your top recommendations would be to those people on the call today, the people from the nonprofit organizations who are considering changing their budget process. And then think about what you would tell those people who have not yet begun to consider changing their process. So, Steve, let's begin with you.
Sure. Well, I have quite a bit of experience in the budget process. I've been doing this for a long time, and not just the nonprofit industry, but in the several industries I've worked in and around throughout my career. And every one of those, doesn't matter what the company is or what industry they're in, everybody does budgets, and there's some common needs I've noticed in all of them. And all of them need simple, easy to use and maintain tools that help provide accurate information for managers to run the business, because at the end of the day, a budget it's just a tool. It's not an end unto itself. It's to help manage and run the business. And I'm pretty excited about our Budget Packs project, because I think I'm going to be able to meet all of these requirements with this one tool. And I'd encourage anybody looking for a budget solution to please take a look at this, because it looks like a good solution for us, and I'm anxious to get started.
Okay, great. Thank you, Steve. And Jill, what recommendations would you have for those folks who are considering changing their budget process or who are not considering changing their process?
Yeah, for those that are not considering it, I would say really? You need to think about this, because for us it really has made a significant improvement both in accountability and in our process as far as being able to roll up the information. So for those that aren't really thinking about it, I think it really improves your budget, or at least that's been our experience. For those that are considering it, I guess the one recommendation, couple of recommendations I would have is, one, I think it's always a good idea to look at a variety of packages. Consider the cost of those, consider your users, but I would definitely put Budget Pack in that mix of the ones you look at. You know, it's been 4 years since we went through our selection process. Maybe things have changed, but our experience through that process is Budget Pack was really unique. So if you're considering making a change, I would at least consider Budget Pack and see the demo of it along with the others, and really, you know, if possible, have some of your users in the room for those demos as well, because that really was a significant kind of aha moment for us as we were looking at the demos.
Okay, thank you, Jill. So we're just about out of time, and there are quite a number of questions, but I'd just like to get to one for each of you before we wrap up. So Jill, just quickly or briefly, what surprised you most about the implementation of the software?
How smoothly it went. I guess it went, we had a very short timeline, and the support staff was extraordinarily diligent and helpful in getting us ready in time. Kind of on the backside of the implementation, we had been through 2 major software implementations in the 18 months before Budget Pack. And as with most software implementations, there was a lot of grumbling and complaints with our users. It was difficult. With the Budget Pack implementation, I actually got emails and calls from my department managers thanking me for implementing the software. That hasn't happened before or since, but they really liked Budget Pack and really saw the value through that first cycle. So I think that was the most surprising thing.
Okay, thank you, Jill. And Steve, one question for you. How do you plan to get your users engaged in using the new system, considering that you're mainly a volunteer organization?
Yeah, getting volunteers involved is a challenge has been since I've been here. But what I found in other areas, and I think this will apply to this project as well, is whatever I ask volunteers to do, since they're not my employees and they don't have to do what I tell them to do, I try to show them that there's value to them, that it will make their lives easier, that whatever it is will help them do their jobs better. And I think that will be the case from everything I've seen so far with Budget Pack. And maybe they'll even like me a little better. So
there you go. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Jill Larsen and Steve Meisberger, for taking your time today to share your experiences in such an engaging and entertaining and informative way. And I know that I learned a lot on this call from the both of you, and I'm certain that everyone who attended this webinar today is walking away with at least one nugget, if not more, of useful information that they can use to begin to think about their budgeting process differently and to begin to make some positive changes. So just to let the people on the call know, this webinar has been recorded, and we'll be happy to send you a link that you can share with your team. And for more information on our company, please visit accelerant.com. Thank you all for attending, and have a pleasant rest of your afternoon.